German generals, men who commanded divisions of tanks and artillery, found themselves frustrated by something they never expected. Not a battleship, not a bomber, not even America's Sherman tank. No, the weapon they couldn't stop was a little four-wheeled machine called the Jeep. The boxy, rugged vehicle that soldiers began to call the car that won World War II. It's 1940. Europe is collapsing. Poland has fallen. France, a nation once thought invincible, has been crushed in a matter of weeks under Hitler's blitzkrieg. The swastika flies over Paris, and Britain is holding on by a thread as German bombers rain fire on London. Across the Atlantic, the United States has not yet entered the war. But military planners are watching, learning and, most importantly, preparing. They see the truth. Modern war is no longer about static lines of trenches like in 1914. This is a new kind of war, a war of movement. The Germans had shown it already. Panzer tanks sweeping across fields, soldiers advancing with speed and precision, supplied by convoys of vehicles. Mobility was the new weapon. If an army couldn't move, it couldn't fight. But here was the problem. In 1939, the U.S. Army was painfully behind. American troops were still using motorcycles with sidecars for scouting missions. Trucks, large, clumsy, and slow, struggled in rough terrain. Soldiers trying to move quickly often found themselves bogged down in mud, stranded in snow, or left behind by mechanical breakdowns. The Army knew it needed something different, something small, agile, and versatile, a vehicle that could carry men, weapons, and supplies over any terrain. It had to be tough, simple to fix, and easy to mass produce. So in the summer of 1940, the U.S. military issued a radical challenge. Build a prototype of a new light reconnaissance vehicle. Deliver it in just 49 days. Less than 2 months to create what could become a war-winning machine. At the time, no one knew this was the beginning of a legend. Yet in the years that followed, the world would come to realize that this little vehicle, the Jeep, was every bit as important to victory as tanks, planes, and aircraft carriers. Because it wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of American ingenuity, mobility, and resilience. A machine that allowed soldiers to go anywhere, fight anywhere, and outmaneuver the enemy. And in the end, German generals themselves would admit, sometimes with shock, sometimes with grudging respect, that the Jeep was one of the weapons that beat them. The story of the Jeep truly begins in the tense summer of 1940. France had just surrendered to Nazi Germany, and Britain was bracing for invasion. Across the Atlantic, U.S. Army leadership understood that war was no longer a distant threat. It was coming. The question was not if America would fight, but when. Inside the War Department, generals debated how to modernize their forces. They knew their soldiers needed mobility. Horses were still officially part of the U.S. cavalry, but this was the age of panzer divisions and Stuka dive bombers. The Army needed a lightweight, fast, all-terrain vehicle, something that could scout, deliver messages, haul men and supplies, even tow light weapons if needed. So, in July 1940, the Army issued one of the most ambitious design challenges in military history. The requirements were astonishing. A prototype had to weigh under 300 pounds, carry 600 pounds of payload, have four-wheel drive, a fold-down windshield, and a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches. And the kicker? The prototype had to be delivered in just 49 days. Most car manufacturers dismissed the challenge as impossible, but 3 companies stepped forward. American Bantam Car Company, Willys Overland, and Ford. Bantam was first. A small company on the edge of bankruptcy, Bantam stunned the Army by delivering their prototype, later known as the Bantam reconnaissance car, on time. It was rough, underpowered, and fragile, but it proved something vital. The idea worked. A small, nimble vehicle could indeed replace the motorcycle and do far more. Army test drivers immediately put the Bantam through punishing trials. Mud, rocky terrain, steep hills. Soldiers were impressed. For the first time, they could drive into places no truck dared go. One officer later said, "It went anywhere the mules could go, and then some." But Bantam was too small a company to mass produce what the Army needed. Enter Willys and Ford. Both companies took Bantam's blueprint, added their own engineering, and began developing improved models. By 1941, Willys delivered the now famous Willys MB, fitted with its powerful Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower heart that could outpull and outrun anything its size. It was rugged, cheap to build, and easy to repair in the field. Soldiers could strip the engine down with a handful of tools. And when the Army compared it to Bantam and Ford's models, one thing became clear. Willys had built something special. Meanwhile, overseas, the Axis powers were watching closely. German intelligence reports noted the sudden appearance of small, square American cars buzzing around training camps. They didn't look like much: flat grills, exposed tires, boxy frames, but appearances were deceiving. By late 1941, as the United States prepared for possible entry into the war, tens of thousands of Jeeps were already being produced. The Army officially adopted the Willys design, with Ford helping to mass produce it under license. Soon, production lines in America roared day and night, cranking out Jeeps by the thousands. One general later quipped, "It only took 2 months to design the Jeep, and the rest of the war to build enough of them." What no one could have known yet was how much this little car would change the battlefield. From deserts to jungles, mountains to frozen fields, the Jeep would prove itself in ways that shocked both friend and foe. And German generals, who once boasted about the mobility of their panzers, would find themselves asking, how did America turn such a simple machine into one of the deadliest tools of modern warfare? December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States is officially at war. Overnight, America mobilizes on a scale the world has never seen, and along with tanks, planes, and rifles, rolling off production lines by the thousands, is the Jeep. By 1942, these little vehicles are landing in North Africa with General Eisenhower's troops. The Desert War is a brutal testing ground. Sand, heat, and long supply lines cripple many vehicles. But the Jeep? It thrives. Its four-wheel drive allows it to climb dunes where German trucks bog down. Its simple design means soldiers can fix it with spare wire, duct tape, or even scavenged parts. German commanders begin noticing them everywhere. In dispatches from the Africa Corps, reports describe the small American cars that seem to dart in and out of the desert like ghosts. Fast, reliable, and armed with mounted machine guns, Jeeps could scout enemy positions, deliver supplies, or even carry wounded men back to safety. Rommel himself, the famed Desert Fox, grudgingly admitted that Allied mobility, powered in part by the Jeep, was a constant frustration. And it wasn't just the desert. As the war widened, Jeeps became universal. In the jungles of the Pacific, they plowed through mud and tropical rain. In the frozen mountains of Italy, they carried ammunition up trails no truck could climb. And on the Eastern Front, where the U.S. sent thousands of Jeeps to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, Russian soldiers were astonished. They nicknamed it the Victory Vehicle, and Stalin himself declared that the Jeep was one of the most vital tools of our victory. German soldiers, on the other hand, were baffled. Their army relied heavily on horses for supply lines. Even in 1942, the mighty Wehrmacht used over 600,000 horses. Meanwhile, the Americans unleashed an army of Jeeps. A machine that could do the work of men and animals, faster, tougher, and more efficient. One Wehrmacht officer later recalled, "The Americans had a car for every 10 men. We had a horse for every 10 men. That is why they moved faster than us." But the Jeep wasn't only about speed. It was about versatility. Soldiers discovered endless ways to use it. They mounted recoilless rifles on it, turned it into ambulances, used it to lay communication wires, even converted them into makeshift trains by swapping the tires for rail wheels. Everywhere the Jeep appeared, it gave the Allies an edge. And soon, German generals began to realize this was no ordinary vehicle. It was a force multiplier, a weapon of mobility. In North Africa, entire German supply lines were ambushed by Allied patrols driving nothing but Jeeps loaded with commandos and machine guns. In one daring raid, the famed long-range Desert Group, working with British SAS, used Jeeps to strike deep behind Axis lines, destroying aircraft and fuel depots before slipping back into the desert. The German reaction was one of disbelief. How could such a simple, almost crude-looking vehicle become such a devastating tool? The answer lay not only in its design, but in the industrial might of America. By 1943, factories in the U.S. were producing a Jeep every few minutes. By the war's end, nearly 650,000 Jeeps would roll off assembly lines, more than the total number of tanks produced by all sides combined. And as those numbers grew, German commanders began to fear something more than just the Jeep itself. They feared what it represented. America's ability to flood the battlefield with endless waves of reliable, versatile machines. For the first time, they realized, this war would not just be decided by guns and tanks, but by the power of mass production. And the Jeep was the proof of it. By 1943, the tide of the war was beginning to shift. The Allies had pushed Rommel out of North Africa. Sicily had fallen, and the next great battleground loomed, Europe itself. And everywhere the Allies advanced, the Jeep came with them. In Italy, Jeeps crawled up mountain trails, ferrying ammunition, rations, and wounded soldiers through terrain that trucks couldn't reach. One American officer recalled, "Without the Jeep, the mule would have been our only option in the mountains. But the Jeep carried more, moved faster, and never complained." Soldiers joked that the Jeep was the iron mule, a beast of burden that could fight back. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers grew increasingly reliant on their American-supplied Jeeps. Soviet commanders were shocked at how these little machines could endure the brutal Russian winter. Where German vehicles froze solid, the Jeep kept rolling. Soviet reports praised it as small but unbreakable. One Red Army general famously said, "The Jeep is as essential to us as the air we breathe." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Marines landed on islands crawling with Japanese defenders. Jeeps rolled off landing craft almost immediately after the first waves of infantry. Their speed and mobility allowed U.S. forces to establish beachheads, haul supplies, and even mount improvised rocket launchers for close fire support. In the jungles of New Guinea, Jeeps were stripped down and used as makeshift tractors, dragging artillery through thick mud where trucks and tanks sank helplessly. But the true turning point, the moment when the Jeep became legendary, came on June 6, 1944. D-Day. On the beaches of Normandy, Jeeps were among the first vehicles to hit the sand. Packed tightly into landing craft, they splashed into the surf under withering German fire. Soldiers drove them through mud, over obstacles, and up onto the bluffs. Within hours, Jeeps were rushing supplies, evacuating the wounded, and carrying commanders inland. Eisenhower himself later remarked, "America could not have won World War II without the Jeep." German soldiers who survived those first days of Normandy later described the shock of seeing Allied columns pouring inland. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and everywhere. Swarms of Jeeps buzzing across the French countryside. The Wehrmacht, still relying on slow horse-drawn wagons for much of its logistics, simply couldn't keep up. The Jeep became a symbol of momentum. Wherever it appeared, the Allies moved faster, struck harder, and pushed deeper. And German generals, once so confident in their blitzkrieg, realized the tables had turned. The Allies now had the mobility advantage, and it was powered not by tanks or planes alone, but by a small, unassuming car. One German officer captured in France put it bluntly, "The Allies have a Jeep for everything. It is impossible to stop them." By late 1944, as the Allies surged through France and toward Germany itself, the Jeep had become more than just a vehicle. It was a battlefield icon. Soldiers trusted it with their lives. Generals relied on it to move their armies. And everywhere it went, it carried the message. The tide of war was turning, and nothing could stop it. By the winter of 1944, the Allies had swept across France, and the German army was desperate. Hitler gambled everything on one last offensive, the Ardennes, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. It was a clash meant to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. But once again, the Jeep played a role far beyond what anyone expected. In the freezing forests of Belgium, where snow choked the roads and ice turned vehicles into wrecks, Jeeps darted between units carrying orders, maps, and commanders. They shuttled ammunition up icy trails, often under direct fire, and hauled wounded men back to field hospitals. Soldiers draped blankets across the open Jeeps and cursed the cold, but they kept going. As one GI put it, The Jeep froze too, but it froze with us, and it never quit. German generals were astonished by how fast the Allies could recover from their initial shock. Their armored spearheads bogged down, fuel ran short, and logistics failed. Meanwhile, Allied supply lines, anchored by endless convoys of trucks and jeeps, kept humming. Even when bridges were blown, jeeps found ways across, planks, pontoons, even fields of frozen mud. Where German columns stalled, Allied jeeps pushed through. By 1945, the jeep was everywhere in Germany. Villagers watched them pour into towns by the hundreds: scouts, ambulances, artillery spotters, reconnaissance teams. Jeeps were among the first vehicles to liberate concentration camps, ferrying stunned survivors to aid stations. They drove into the heart of Berlin when the war ended, carrying officers and journalists eager to record history. It wasn't just soldiers who praised them. German generals, captured and interrogated, admitted the jeep had shocked them. For decades they had trusted in tanks and railroads, but America's genius had been in mobility, and the jeep embodied it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, once remarked, "The jeep is the greatest weapon the Americans ever produced." In total, America built over 600,000 jeeps during World War II. They crossed deserts, mountains, jungles, and frozen forests. They pulled artillery, carried generals, delivered mail, and saved the wounded. They became so ubiquitous that GIs said, "God made the world, but the jeep made it small." The resolution of the war did not come from any single weapon. It came from an overwhelming machine of industry and innovation. But among the tanks, planes, and battleships, one small four-wheeled vehicle proved indispensable. When the German generals finally looked back, they realized it wasn't just Sherman tanks, B-17 bombers, or Liberty ships that had beaten them. It was also the humble jeep, grinding relentlessly across Europe and showing no mercy to distance, terrain, or weather. The war in Europe was ending, and with every advancing column of Allied troops, the jeep was there, dusty, scarred, but still running. To the Germans, it was a symbol of inevitability. To the Allies, it was proof that no obstacle was too great. The jeep had carried them to victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the jeep didn't disappear. In fact, its story was only beginning. Surplus jeeps flooded across Europe and Asia, sold cheaply or given away as aid. Farmers plowed fields with them, explorers took them into mountains, and police forces adopted them as patrol vehicles. In France, Italy, and the Philippines, jeeps became everyday sights, symbols of liberation and resilience. For many, it was the first motor vehicle they had ever seen in their village. In the U.S., the jeep sparked something new: the civilian off-road market. Soldiers returning home wanted the same rugged little car they had trusted in battle. Willys, the main wartime producer, rebranded the Jeep as the CJ, civilian Jeep. By the late 1940s, it had become the foundation of an industry that still thrives today. Every modern SUV and 4x4 traces some of its DNA back to the little war machine that conquered continents. But perhaps the greatest twist lies in how the Jeep influenced its enemies. Captured Jeeps were so valued by the Wehrmacht that they repainted them and used them in their own units. Even Japan, stunned by their reliability, tried to copy the design. Yet none could match the simplicity, durability, and sheer adaptability of the American original. German generals who once mocked it admitted in hindsight that the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a strategic advantage. Unlike tanks that could be destroyed or planes that needed massive support, the Jeep was everywhere, always moving, always supporting. Its victory wasn't in firepower, it was in presence. And that presence was overwhelming. Today, surviving WW2 Jeeps still roll in parades, car shows, and memorial events. They remind us of a time when a small, unassuming machine carried the weight of a world at war. And that's the real story. The Jeep, underestimated by many, became one of the most decisive weapons of the 20th century. It helped win a war not by brute force, but by endurance, adaptability, and sheer persistence. So the next time you see a Jeep on the road, remember, It's not just a car. It's a piece of history. A machine that even German generals admitted helped America win the war. If you enjoyed this untold WW2 story and want more deep dives into the hidden weapons, strategies, and moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, share this with fellow history fans, and stay tuned, because we're just getting started uncovering the incredible stories of World War II.